Chapter 1. Everyone in the city feared the Ice Queen of the Malloy group. Everyone except the man currently sitting with his muddy boots propped up on her $3 million mahogany desk. Anna kept her eyes fixed on the financial spreadsheet projected onto the wall of her private executive suite. Her face was an unreadable sheet of marble, but underneath the desk, her fingers were gripping her designer pen so hard the plastic clicked. The third quarter projections for the logistics division are down by 4%, Anna said. Her voice was smooth, freezing, and perfectly modulated. It was the voice that made grown board members break into a sweat. If these numbers don't correct by Friday, I am replacing the entire management tier. Am I clear, Mr. Vance? The head of logistics, a man in his 50s with 20 years of corporate experience, looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Yes, Ms. Malloy, absolutely. We're working on the supply chain issues. You have 4 days, Anna cut him off, her gaze slicing through the room. Don't bring me excuses. Bring me, crunch. The sound was sharp, loud, and completely out of place in a room that smelled of expensive leather and corporate anxiety. Every head in the room jerked toward the corner of the office. George was sitting in one of Anna's pristine, white leather accent chairs. He had his legs crossed at the ankles, resting right on the edge of her spotless desk, leaving a faint smear of dried earth near her laptop. He was wearing a faded leather jacket that had seen better decades, a plain black t-shirt, and jeans that definitely didn't belong in a multi-billion-dollar headquarters. In his left hand, he held a plastic bag from a greasy takeaway joint down the street. In his right hand, a half-eaten apple. He bit into it again. Crunch. Asterisk. Sorry, George said, flashing a quick, lazy grin that showed a hint of a dimple. He didn't look sorry at all. His dark eyes were bright with pure amusement. Don't let me stop the execution. Carry on, sweetheart. You were doing the whole human blizzard thing. It's very hot. A collective, terrified gasp seemed to be sucked out of the 3 executives present. Nobody spoke to Anna Malloy like that. Nobody survived it. Anna's chest tightened. A sudden, chaotic wave of heat rushed up her neck, completely threatening to shatter the cold facade she had spent years building. Why is he here? Why today? Internally, she was in a state of absolute, frantic panic, but she forced her expression to remain deadpan. She looked at her assistants. Leave us, she commanded. The executives didn't need to be told twice. They practically scrambled over each other to get to the heavy double doors, shutting them firmly behind them. The moment the latch clicked, the silence in the room became heavy. George didn't move. He just lowered his boots from the desk, stood up with an effortless, fluid grace that didn't match his lazy persona, and strolled over to her side. He smelled like rain, cedarwood, and the cheap fried chicken from the bag he was carrying. You're late for lunch, George murmured, setting the greasy bag directly on top of her neatly stacked, confidential files. Anna stared at the bag, then up at him. She forced her voice into its sharpest, coldest edge. George, get your things and get out. I am in the middle of a corporate restructuring. I don't have time for your games. Instead of backing away, George leaned forward. He placed both hands on the armrests of her executive chair, effectively trapping her. The proximity was sudden, suffocating, and entirely intentional. Anna's breath hitched. She tried to look away, to focus on her laptop, but he was too close. She could see the faint stubble along his jawline, the casual, dangerous confidence. In his dark eyes, her heart began to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. She hated how easily he did this. She hated how, with just a step, he turned her from a ruthless CEO into a flustered girl who couldn't remember her own name. You always have time for me, George whispered. His voice was low, a smooth purr that vibrated right through her. He reached out, his thumb lightly brushing against her collarbone as he adjusted the slightly crooked lapel of her sharp blazer. His fingers were warm against her skin, and Anna felt a shiver run straight down her spine. Get off me, she muttered, though she didn't push him. Her hands remained frozen on her lap. We have a contract, George. You play the part of the quiet husband, and I keep funding your lifestyle. Pushing your way into my office violates that. George chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. He leaned in a fraction closer, his lips almost brushing her ear. The contract says I can't embarrass you in public. I'm not embarrassing you, Anna. I'm taking care of you. Look at you. Your shoulders are like iron. Before she could protest, his large hands moved to her shoulders, his thumbs digging firmly but gently into the tense muscles at the base of her neck. Anna bit her lip to keep a gasp from escaping. The relief was instant, but the intimacy of it was terrifying. She tried to pull away, but George's grip was unyielding. He didn't use brute force. He just used a calm, absolute authority that made her feel entirely powerless. "Stop," she whispered, her voice losing its icy edge, sounding dangerously soft. "Someone will walk in. Let them," George said smoothly. He stopped the massage but didn't retreat. Instead, he reached down, took a napkin from the takeaway bag, and unrolled a messy, grease-stained chicken wrap. He held it right in front of her mouth. "Eat. You haven't had a meal since 6 a.m. I checked with your secretary. I am not eating that garbage in my office," she snapped, trying to regain her ground. George smiled, his eyes locking onto hers. There was a look in his gaze, something deep, dark, and utterly possessive, that always made her feel like she was a prey animal being watched by a very patient predator. He didn't look like a lazy, gold-digging husband right now. He looked like a man who owned the room, the building, and her. "Open up, Anna," he said softly. It wasn't a request. Her lips parted automatically, a traitorous reaction she couldn't control. George fed her a small bite, his fingers brushing against her bottom lip as he did. He wiped away a tiny speck of sauce with his thumb, his gaze lingering on her mouth for a second too long before he pulled back. Anna chewed quickly, her face burning. To hide her confusion, she reached for her desk phone. "I'm calling security. You're disruptive." George didn't even try to stop her. He just leaned back against her desk, folding his arms, watching her with that infuriating, knowing smirk. "Go ahead. Tell them your husband is forcing you to eat lunch. See what the tabloids do with that tomorrow." She dropped the receiver back onto the cradle with a loud clatter. "I hate you. I know," George said cheerfully, his eyes crinkling. "You absolutely loathe me. That's why your pulse is currently hitting about 120 beats per minute." He pointed a finger at the smart watch on her wrist, which was flashing a high heart rate notification. Anna quickly covered the watch with her hand, her jaw tightening. "Damn him. He notices everything." Asterisk. Before she could think of a sharp enough retort to salvage her dignity, the heavy mahogany doors to her office didn't just open, they burst inward. Anna's posture instantly snapped back into her rigid, icy corporate stance. George, however, didn't blink. He didn't even take his back off the edge of her desk. Standing in the doorway was Uncle Julian. Julian Malloy was the senior vice president of the Malloy Group and Anna's biggest headache. He was a man built on greed, dressed in a bespoke gray suit, his face contorted into a mask of smug satisfaction. Behind him stood two uniformed security guards and the head of legal affairs. "Anna," Julian boomed, stepping into the room without an invitation. He didn't look at George, treating him like a piece of trash left on the floor. "I told you that running this company requires maturity. But it seems you are too busy playing house with your useless companion to notice the house is burning down." Anna stood up slowly, her hands resting flat on her desk. The Ice Queen was fully back. "Julian, you know the rules about entering my office without an appointment. State your business or leave." Julian laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. He tossed a thick, leather-bound document onto the center of her desk, right next to George's grease-stained takeaway bag. "My business is the survival of this family's legacy," Julian said, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. "The board of directors just called an emergency session. A major compliance violation from 3 years ago has just been leaked to the regulatory authorities. It has your signature all over it, Anna." Anna's heart went completely cold, not from fluster this time, but from a sudden, sharp dread. 3 years ago, that was the logistics merger. I vetted every document myself. There were no violations. Asterisk. It's a fabrication, Anna said evenly. "Tell that to the press waiting downstairs," Julian sneered, leaning over the desk, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper. "The board is already panicked. They want stability. By tomorrow morning, I will have the votes to strip you of your CEO title and place you on indefinite administrative leave. And as for your little arrangement," Julian finally glanced at George, his eyes full of utter disgust. Once you are stripped of your assets, we'll see how long this leech stays by your side. Anna felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. She looked at the document, her mind racing through damage control strategies, legal defenses, public relations shields, but everything was happening too fast. If the board panicked, she was done. She felt a cold sweat breaking out on the back of her neck. She was alone, entirely alone against a coup she hadn't seen coming. Then, a hand settled gently, heavily, on the small of her back. The warmth of it cut right through her panic. She looked up. George was no longer leaning lazily against the desk. He had straightened up to his full height, easily towering over Julian. The amused, playful look in his eyes was entirely gone. In its place was something cold, sharp, and incredibly dark. The air in the room suddenly felt 10 degrees colder, and for the first time, it wasn't because of Anna. George reached out, his long fingers casually picking up the thick document Julian had thrown down. He flipped through the first few pages with one hand, his expression completely unreadable. "Interesting," George murmured. His voice was no longer a lazy purr. It was quiet, steady, and carried a strange, dangerous weight that made Julian unconsciously take a half step back. "Put that down, boy," Julian barked, trying to regain his dominant posture. "This is a corporate matter. Go back to spending my niece's allowance." George didn't look up from the pages. A faint, chilling smile touched his lips. The Malloy Group Logistics Merger, July 2023. Page 42 mentions a offshore holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. The signature on the authorization form says, Anna Malloy. George finally closed the booklet with a soft thud and looked directly into Julian's eyes. "But the routing number for the initial escrow deposit belongs to a private Swiss account registered under your name, Julian. Specifically, your secondary shell corporation, JM Holdings." The room went dead silent. Julian's face drained of color so fast he looked almost gray. What nonsense are you talking about? You don't know anything about finance, you lazy." "I know that the original, unredacted encryption keys for that specific transaction are currently sitting on a secure server," George interrupted smoothly. He took a step forward, invading Julian's personal space. George didn't raise his voice, but the sheer, predatory intensity radiating from him made the security guards at the door visibly stiffen. "And I know that if those keys are delivered to the federal prosecutor's office in the next 10 minutes, you won't be sitting in a board meeting tomorrow. You'll be sitting in a federal holding cell." Anna stared at her husband, her mind completely spinning. How does he know that? How could he possibly have access to the unredacted merger keys? Even I couldn't get those. Asterisk. Julian's hands were shaking. He swallowed hard, looking at George as if he were seeing a ghost. Who the hell are you?" George reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and casually tapped the screen once. He held it up to show Julian a running digital timer counting down from 60 seconds. "You have exactly 1 minute to call your friends on the board and tell them the emergency session is cancelled due to a clerical error on your part," George said, his voice entirely calm, entirely terrifying. "If that timer hits 0, the upload completes automatically." Julian stared at the phone, then at George's eyes, realizing with absolute certainty that this man wasn't bluffing. Panic took over. Julian frantically pulled his own phone from his jacket pocket, his fingers trembling so badly he dropped it once before forcing a call through. "Cancel it," Julian yelled into the receiver, his voice cracking. "Cancel the board meeting now." "Yes, an error. Just do it." He hung up, breathing heavily, staring at George like a broken man. George tapped his screen again, stopping the timer with 5 seconds left. He slid the phone back into his pocket and turned his back on Julian, completely dismissing him. "Get out of my wife's office," George said quietly. "You're ruining her appetite." Julian didn't say another word. He turned and practically fled the room, his security guards and legal counsel scrambling to follow him. The heavy doors slammed shut once more. Anna stood frozen behind her desk. The silence in the office was deafening. She stared at George, the man who spent his afternoons playing video games in her penthouse, the man who asked her for a credit card to buy expensive shoes, the man who treated life like a joke. He was currently standing there, calm, collected, and completely shrouded in a dangerous mystery she couldn't penetrate. "George," Anna whispered, her voice trembling slightly. What did you just do? Who are you? George turned around. The dark, terrifying aura vanished in an instant, replaced by that familiar, lazy, heartbreaking smirk. He walked back to her, stepping right into her space, and reached out to pick up the half-eaten chicken wrap. I told you, sweetheart, George murmured, his eyes locking onto hers with a warmth that made her knees weak. I'm your husband. Now stop asking questions and finish your lunch. We have a very long night ahead of us. Chapter 2. Anna didn't move. Her eyes remained locked on his, trying to read the shifting shadows behind his casual smile. The chicken wrap was still hovering inches from her face, but the corporate crisis that had just threatened to destroy her entire life had been replaced by a much closer, much more intimate danger. Don't give me that, she said, her voice dropping into a fierce whisper as she finally found her tongue. She reached up, wrapping her fingers tightly around his wrist to push his hand away. His skin was warm, his pulse steady beneath her palms. You just blackmailed a senior vice president of a multinational conglomerate with encrypted financial data that shouldn't even exist. Where did you get those routing numbers, George? George didn't struggle against her grip. Instead, he let his wrist go limp, allowing her to guide his hand down, but he didn't pull away. He stepped even closer, his thigh brushing against the edge of her skirt. I have a lot of friends in low places, Anna, he said softly, his voice teasing but his eyes completely focused on her. You'd be surprised what people talk about when you buy them a cheap drink. That wasn't bar talk data, and you know it. Anna's fingers tightened on his wrist, a desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of control. Her mind was a chaotic storm. Who is he? Did I marry a criminal? A corporate spy? Julian has been hiding those accounts for years. Not even my private investigators found them. Then you need to hire better investigators, George murmured. He tilted his head, his gaze dropping to where her hand was still gripping him. A slow, knowing smile spread across his lips. Are you going to keep holding on to me like that, or are we going to talk about how you just let your uncle walk all over you? Anna realized with a sudden jolt of embarrassment that she was still clutching his wrist. She let go instantly, pulling her hand back as if she'd been burned, and took a step away from him. She smoothed down her blazer, desperately trying to summon the Ice Queen back from the dead. I didn't let him walk over me. I was calculating a counter-strategy. Right, a counter-strategy that involved looking like you were about to faint. George chuckled, turning around to lean his hips against her desk again, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked entirely at home in her terrifyingly expensive office. You're brilliant, Anna. In a boardroom, you're a shark. But you're too clean. You expect people to play by the rules. Men like Julian don't care about the rules. And you do, Anna asked, her eyes narrowing. I care about what's mine, George said. The playful tone vanished for a fraction of a second, replaced by a deep, resonant gravity that sent a physical shiver straight down her spine. His dark eyes locked onto hers, heavy and unblinking. And right now, your contract says you're mine. I don't like other people touching my things. Things. He called her his thing, yet the word didn't feel insulting. It felt terrifyingly possessive. It felt like a claim. Anna felt the heat returning to her cheeks, her carefully constructed defenses melting under the sheer weight of his gaze. She looked away, focusing blindly on her laptop screen. The contract is a financial arrangement, she muttered, though her voice lacked its usual sting. Speaking of which, how much did that data cost you? Tell me the amount and I'll have accounting reimburse you. George let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. Always trying to pay me off, aren't you, Anna? You think every problem can be solved with a check from the Malloy group. He straightened up and walked toward the door. For a moment, Anna felt a sudden, strange pang of panic. Is he leaving? But he didn't open the door. Instead, he reached out and turned the heavy brass lock, clicking it firmly into place. The sound of the lock sliding home felt like a starter pistol going off in Anna's chest. What are you doing? She asked, her voice rising slightly. George, lock the door back. My assistants. Your assistants are currently hiding in the break room, terrified that Uncle Julian is going to fire them, George said smoothly, walking back toward her with slow, deliberate steps. We won't be disturbed. George, I have a meeting in 20 minutes, she lied, her fingers gripping the edge of her desk as he closed the distance between them. Cancel it, he said. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of her. The lazy, shameless playboy was completely gone now. There was an intense, dominant energy radiating off him that made the air in the room feel heavy and thick. He reached out, his long fingers gently catching her chin, forcing her to tilt her head up to look at him. Anna's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted to his lips, then back to his dark, mesmerizing gaze. She wanted to push him away, to demand answers, to remind him of his place, but her body refused to cooperate. Her heart was beating so loudly she was certain he could hear it. "You're a terrible liar when you're scared," George whispered, his thumb lightly tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was incredibly gentle, contrasting sharply with the raw power in his eyes. "And you're shaking." "I am not shaking," she breathed, though a tiny tremor in her lower lip betrayed her. "You are," he insisted softly. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. Anna could feel the warm whisper of his breath against her skin. "You've been holding your breath for the last 10 minutes. Breathe, Anna." She took a sharp, ragged breath, her eyes fluttering shut for a brief second as his scent, cedarwood, rain, and pure masculinity, overwhelmed her senses. When she opened her eyes, George was looking at her with a mixture of intense hunger and deep, unspoken affection. "Why do you do this?" she asked, her voice cracking, completely stripped of its corporate armor. "Why do you play the fool out there, and then do this to me in here?" George smiled, a soft, genuine expression that she rarely got to see. He leaned in, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear as he whispered, "Because I like seeing what's underneath the ice, Anna. Everyone else gets the CEO. I only want the girl who forgets how to breathe when I touch her." Before she could process the warmth spreading through her chest, George pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. He slid his hand from her chin down to her neck, his fingers resting right over her frantic pulse. "Now," he murmured, his voice returning to that smooth, confident purr. "About my reward for saving your empire." Anna swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want, George?" "I want you to leave this office right now. Put on your coat, tell your secretary you're done for the day, and come home with me. I cooked dinner." Anna blinked, the sudden, mundane request completely throwing her off balance. "Dinner? But the logistics division. The logistics division will still be failing tomorrow," George cut her off, his thumb rubbing a comforting circle against her neck. "Today, you're coming home." She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of a joke, but his eyes were completely serious. For the first time in her life, the overwhelming weight of the Malloy group felt lighter. The urge to simply give up control, even just for an evening, was incredibly tempting. "Fine," she whispered, her shoulders finally dropping as the tension drained from her body. "But you're driving." "I'm too tired." "Deal," George said, his smile widening. He stepped back, giving her space to breathe, and reached for her designer trench coat hanging on the rack nearby. Anna watched him, a strange, warm feeling blooming in her stomach. He was a mystery, a dangerous wildcard who had just single-handedly manipulated a corporate war, but in his hands, she felt safer than she ever had in her life. She walked around her desk, grabbing her purse, while George held the coat open for her. She slipped her arms into the sleeves, feeling his hands linger on her shoulders for a brief moment as he smoothed down the fabric. "Ready?" he asked, walking toward the locked double doors. "Ready," Anna said, adjusting her mask one last time as she stepped up beside him. George unlocked the door and swung it open. The bright, sterile lights of the executive hallway greeted them. Anna's secretary, a young woman named Lily, was hovering near her desk, looking pale and anxious. "Ms. Malloy," Lily gasped, jumping slightly. Is everything all right?" Vice President Julian left in quite a hurry, and "Everything is handled, Lily," Anna said, her voice perfectly calm and freezing once again. "Cancel the rest of my calendar for the afternoon. I am leaving for the day." Lily's eyes widened in shock. Anna Malloy had never left early a day in her life. "Oh, yes, ma'am. Absolutely." George flashed Lily a bright, lazy grin, slipping his hands into his leather jacket pockets. "Make sure she doesn't check her emails, Lily. I'm putting her on a strict corporate detox." Lily gave a hesitant, confused smile, nodding quickly. George turned to Anna, offering his arm with a dramatic, playful bow. Anna rolled her eyes, but underneath her cold exterior, her heart did a tiny, traitorous flip. She didn't take his arm, but she walked closely by his side as they moved toward the private executive elevator. The elevator ride down to the VIP parking garage was silent, but the air between them was humming with an unspoken, heavy tension. George stood close enough that his arm brushed against hers with every movement of the elevator. Anna kept her eyes on the digital floor indicator, but her mind was entirely focused on the man beside her. When the doors opened into the dim, quiet parking garage, George led her toward his car, a sleek, matte black sports car that cost more than a luxury apartment, paid for entirely by Anna's corporate allowance. Or so she had thought. Now, she wasn't so sure where the money for his lifestyle actually came from. George unlocked the car and opened the passenger door for her. As Anna stepped in, her phone in her purse suddenly began to vibrate violently. She pulled it out, expecting a call from a panicked board member. Instead, the screen displayed an restricted, unknown number. Anna frowned, answering the call and placing the phone to her ear. Anna Malloy. There was a moment of heavy static on the other end of the line. Then, a distorted, synthesized voice spoke, the words sending a sudden, icy dread straight through her veins. "You think your husband saved you today, Ms. Malloy," the voice hissed, chillingly calm. "Tell George that his little stunt with the Swiss accounts just alerted the people he's been running from for the last 5 years. Enjoy your dinner. It might be your last." The line went dead. Anna froze, the phone slipping slightly in her hand as George closed the passenger door, completely oblivious to the call, and began walking around to the driver's side. Chapter 3. The heavy oak double doors of the Malloy Group's grand boardroom didn't just open, they flew inward with a violent, echoing thud that rattled the crystal chandelier overhead. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, stale coffee, and raw corporate malice. Uncle Julian stood at the head of the massive, polished mahogany table, his hand raised mid-gesture as he delivered what was supposed to be the final blow to Anna's career. Surrounding him were 20 of the company's most powerful board directors, their faces a sea of grim, judgmental stares. Anna sat, perfectly rigid at the opposite end of the table. Her hands were folded neatly on top of her tablet, her spine a flawless, unyielding line of marble. To anyone else, she looked entirely unbothered, a literal queen sitting on a crumbling throne. But beneath the table, her knuckles were white, and her heels were dug so hard into the plush carpet that her calves ached. "The motion has been tabled, and the evidence of compliance fraud is clear," Julian was booming, his voice echoing off the glass walls that overlooked the city skyline. Anna's personal life and lack of administrative oversight have made her a liability. "We cannot let a multi-billion-dollar empire be dragged into the mud because our CEO is distracted by a lazy, gold-digging playboy she brought into this family. I call for an immediate vote to strip. You know, Julian, for a guy who talks so much about the mud, you sure love rolling around in it." The voice was low, smooth, and laced with an infuriating, lazy drawl. Every single head in the boardroom jerked toward the entrance. George stood in the doorway. But the man leaning against the frame wasn't the shameless, casual slacker they were all used to seeing in the tabloids. The faded leather jacket and scuffed boots were gone. Instead, George was wearing a charcoal gray, bespoke three-piece suit that fit his broad shoulders with lethal precision. The fabric was impeccable, the tailoring so sharp it screamed raw, unadulterated power. His dark hair was cleanly styled, and a matte black luxury watch glinted from beneath his crisp white cuff. He looked less like a kept husband and more like a dominant apex predator who had just stumbled into a room full of sheep. Anna's breath entirely hitched, her eyes widened by a fraction of a millimeter, her heart slamming against her ribs with a sudden, violent force. George. Her mind spun into absolute chaos. He had never worn a suit around her. He had never looked at a room full of billionaires with that level of absolute, chilling condescension. Julian's face flushed a dangerous, angry purple. "George, what is the meaning of this? Security. How did this useless? Security is currently rewriting their resumes down the hall," George interrupted smoothly. He stepped into the room, his leather dress shoes clicking rhythmically against the hardwood perimeter of the floor. He didn't look at Julian. His eyes were locked entirely on Anna, a small, private smirk playing at the corner of his lips as he noticed the faint blush creeping up her neck. Sorry I'm late, sweetheart. Traffic was a nightmare, and my tailor wanted to make sure the shoulders were perfect. George, Anna managed to say, her voice freezing but carrying a subtle, desperate undertone of panic. This is a closed boardroom session. You need to leave, now. I don't think so, George said, stopping right at the center of the massive table. He casually slipped one hand into his trousers pocket, while the other tossed a sleek, encrypted flash drive onto the glossy mahogany surface. It slid perfectly across the wood, stopping right in front of the head of legal affairs. What is that? Julian barked, his voice losing some of its booming authority, replaced by a sudden, nervous edge. That, George murmured, turning his dark, piercing gaze onto Julian, is a complete forensic audit of the Malloy Group's offshore logistics subsidiaries over the last 48 hours. Along with the unredacted IP addresses of the specific terminal that leaked those fabricated compliance documents to the press this morning. The room went dead silent. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. The head of legal affairs, a cynical man who had seen everything, plugged the drive into his laptop. Within 5 seconds, his eyes widened, and he broke into a visible sweat. He looked up at Julian, his voice trembling. Julian, these are internal administrative access logs. They trace directly back to your private residential network. The timestamps match the leak exactly. A collective murmur broke out among the board directors. The hostile glares that had been directed at Anna for the last 2 hours instantly pivoted toward Julian. This is a setup, a blatant lie, Julian shouted, slamming his fists on the table. He pointed a shaking finger at George. He's a fraud. He's using fabricated data to protect his meal ticket. Look at him. He's a nobody living off my family's wealth. George didn't get angry. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply took a slow step toward Julian, his smile fading into something cold, dark, and utterly terrifying. The sheer intensity radiating off him made 2 of the directors sitting nearest to him instinctively pull their chairs back. Let's talk about wealth, Julian, George said, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded the entire room. Yesterday afternoon, a sudden, anonymous short attack hit the Malloy Group's stock, wiping out 3% of its valuation in an hour. You thought it was a market reaction to Anna's alleged crisis. But the capital used to trigger that short came from an offshore account in Nassau. George reached down, resting his palms flat on the table, leaning in toward Julian until they were eye to eye. An account that I bought out at 8 a.m. this morning. I currently control 45% of your personal holding company's debt, Julian. If I snap my fingers, your entire personal net worth evaporates before the closing bell. So, let me ask you a question. Who is the nobody in this room? Julian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just looked over the edge of a cliff and realized someone was standing behind him, ready to push. He sank slowly back into his executive chair, his face completely pale, his hands shaking so violently he had to hide them beneath the desk. Anna stared at her husband, her mind completely blank with shock. He bought out Julian's debt. In 4 hours. Who has that kind of liquidity? Who is he? The mysterious warning from the synthesized voice on her phone flashed through her mind. The people he's been running from. George straightened up, the terrifying aura vanishing instantly as he turned back toward Anna. The lazy, heartbreaking smirk returned to his face, his eyes crinkling with pure, unadulterated amusement as he looked at her flustered expression. He walked down the length of the table, stopping right beside her executive chair. The entire board watched him in absolute, terrified awe. Now that the clerical errors have been sorted out, George said smoothly, his voice echoing in the quiet room, I believe this meeting is adjourned. None of the directors objected. In fact, 3 of them stood up and began packing their briefcases immediately. George didn't wait for them to leave. He reached down, his large, warm hands gently gripping the armrests of Anna's chair, spinning her around to face him. He leaned down, trapping her between his arms, his face inches from hers. You did great, sweetheart, he whispered, his breath warm against her lips. But you look exhausted, George, she whispered back, her voice losing all of its ice, her fingers clutching the fabric of her skirt to keep from reaching out and touching his sharp lapels. What did you do? You promised me you wouldn't interfere like this. I promised I wouldn't embarrass you, George corrected softly, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, possessive intensity that made her core melt. Saving your life isn't an embarrassment. It's a marital perk. Before Anna could process his words, George slid one arm behind her back and the other beneath her knees. With an effortless, fluid motion, he lifted her right out of her executive chair, cradling her securely against his chest in front of the remaining board members. Anna's mind went into an absolute, frantic panic. Her face burned a brilliant crimson. George, put me down. What are you doing? Everyone is looking. Let them look. George chuckled, turning around and walking toward the boardroom exit with steady, arrogant strides. My wife hasn't had breakfast yet, and I get very protective of her health when she's stressed. He carried her out of the boardroom and straight into the private executive elevator, the doors sliding shut and cutting off the stunned stares of her entire executive tier. The moment the elevator doors sealed, the heavy, high-stakes tension of the corporate world vanished, replaced by an even tighter, suffocatingly intimate atmosphere. George didn't put her down. He kept her pressed firmly against his chest, his heart beating a steady, calm rhythm against her shoulder. Anna hid her face in the crook of his neck, her hands finally moving to grip the fabric of his bespoke jacket. She could smell the familiar scent of rain and cedarwood, but mixed with the crisp, expensive scent of the new suit, it was utterly overwhelming. You're shameless, she muttered into his skin, her voice trembling with a mix of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated fluster. I'm efficient, George murmured back, his grip tightening around her waist as the elevator began its smooth descent. He tilted his head down, his lips brushing against her ear. But we aren't done, Anna. You still owe me a reward for saving your empire. And this time, I'm not letting you off with just a dinner. Before Anna could reply, her phone in her purse buzzed again. A text message from the same restricted number popped onto the lock screen, visible in the reflection of the elevator's polished metal walls. He's good, Ms. Malloy, but the bait has been taken. See you soon. Chapter 4. The private elevator sank toward the VIP garage in an agonizingly slow, rhythmic descent. The metal walls reflected the two of them, the Ice Queen CEO buried in the chest of her allegedly useless husband, who was now wrapped in a three-piece suit that fit like custom armor. Anna's eyes were locked on the glowing reflection of her phone screen. He's good, Ms. Malloy, but the bait has been taken. See you soon. Asterisk. Her fingers went completely numb. The adrenaline from their boardroom victory vanished, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread. They weren't just trying to destroy the Malloy group, they were using her company to force George into the light. And it had worked. To save her, George had exposed his financial teeth, his encryption keys, and his true capabilities. George, she whispered, her voice cracking against the crisp fabric of his collar. Put me down, please. George didn't argue this time. The elevator bell chimed as it reached the dim, concrete vastness of the secure parking level. He let her feet touch the ground, but he didn't step back. His hands stayed firmly on her waist, his thumbs tracing the line of her hips through her trench coat. What's wrong? He asked. The lazy, teasing tone was gone. His dark eyes narrowed, instantly locking onto the pale, rigid tension in her face. Julian is done, Anna. He won't breathe in your direction without checking the wind first. You don't have to look like the world is ending. Anna forced her hands to remain steady as she dropped the phone back into her purse. She couldn't tell him if whoever was on the other end of that phone was dangerous enough to make a man like George hide for 5 years under a slacker persona. Telling him might make him run again. Or worse, it might get him killed. She had spent years pretending she didn't care about this marriage, but the mere thought of George vanishing from her life made her chest ache with a physical, violent panic. I'm fine, she lied, her voice snapping back into its sharp, freezing corporate register. She pushed his hands off her waist, stepping out of his space and smoothing down her blazer. I'm just tired of the drama. And I'm tired of being carried around like a trophy. I have work to do. George watched her drop the barrier, his expression turning unreadable. The silence between them stretched, heavy and tense, under the buzzing fluorescent lights of the garage. Work, he repeated softly. A faint, humorless smile touched his lips. Right, back to the ice castle. Yes, Anna said, refusing to look him in the eye because she knew he'd see right through her. The board meeting was cancelled, but the market is still volatile. I need to oversee the PR response myself. Go home, George. I'll take a company car up to my office. She turned and walked toward the security desk without waiting for his response, her heels clicking aggressively against the concrete. Every step felt like a lie. She wasn't running back to work to save the company, she was running to build a wall between them before she completely broke down and begged him to tell her who he really was. George didn't follow her. He just stood by his sleek black sports car, his hands sliding slowly into his trousers pockets, his dark eyes tracking her silhouette until the glass doors of the elevator lobby shut behind her. 3 hours later, the top floor of the Malloy Group headquarters was a ghost town. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the massive executive office in deep, bleeding shades of amber and violet. Anna sat behind her mahogany desk, but the laptop in front of her was black. She hadn't typed a single word since she returned. I ban him. Asterisk. The thought was chaotic, desperate, and entirely fueled by panic. She had spent the last 3 hours drafting a formal security memo. It was sitting on her tablet, waiting for her authorization. Effective immediately, George Malloy is restricted from accessing the executive suite without a prior scheduled appointment and direct clearance from the CEO. Asterisk. It was her last line of defense. If she kept him away from the office, if she forced him back into the role of the distant, lazy husband, maybe the people watching them would think the boardroom display was a fluke. Maybe she could keep him safe by freezing him out. You're writing a lot of words for someone who isn't doing any work, a voice murmured from the shadows near the lounge. Anna's heart violently jumped. She looked up, her hand instantly covering the tablet screen. George was sitting on the arm of her velvet sofa in the far corner of the room. The jacket of his suit was gone, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the lean, corded muscle of his wrists. He had a glass of amber liquid in his hand, ice clinking softly against the crystal. How did you get in here? Anna demanded, her voice rising as her internal panic spiked. I told security. I told you 3 hours ago, Anna. Your security works for me now, George said smoothly. He stood up, setting the glass down on a side table, and walked toward her desk. The easy, playful smirk was completely missing. His steps were slow, heavy, and deliberate. You issued a memo to ban me from your floor. Anna swallowed hard, her spine stiffening against her chair. It's a corporate security measure. Your presence today disrupted the entire administrative tier. Lie, George said, stopping right at the edge of her desk. He leaned forward, placing both palms flat on the polished wood, looming over her. The amber twilight caught the sharp angles of his jaw, making him look incredibly dangerous. You're hiding behind your desk again. Why, Anna? Because I ruined your perfect, untouchable image. Or because you realized you actually like it when I take control. Don't flatter yourself, Anna snapped, her fingers tightening into fists on her lap. She forced herself to look directly into his dark, piercing gaze, trying to summon every ounce of the Ice Queen. You played a high-stakes game today to protect your lifestyle. I appreciate the leverage you used against Julian, but this is my company. My empire. I don't need a savior, and I certainly don't need a husband who handles corporate affairs through blackmail. George didn't blink. He listened to her tirade with a calm, chilling patience that made her skin prickle. Are you done? He asked quietly. Yes. Sign the acknowledgement for the security restriction and leave. Instead of reaching for the tablet, George moved with a fluid, terrifying speed. He bypassed the width of the desk, grabbed the armrests of her executive chair, and spun her violently around to face him. Before she could gasp, he sank down on one knee, trapping her in the seat, his face inches from hers. George, she gasped, her hands instinctively flying to his broad shoulders to push him back. It was like trying to move a brick wall. His chest was solid, warm, and vibrating with a low, dangerous energy. Look at me, George commanded, his voice a dark, velvet baritone that commanded absolute obedience. He reached up, his long fingers wrapping firmly but gently around her jaw, tilting her face up. Look at my eyes, Anna. Tell me you want me to leave. Anna's breath entirely hitched. Her gaze darted across his features, the intense, fierce possessiveness in his eyes, the slight curve of his lips, the raw masculinity that completely overwhelmed her senses. Her heart was hammering so loudly against her ribs she was certain he could feel it through her hands on his shoulders. I want you to follow the contract, she whispered, her voice failing her entirely, the ice melting into a desperate, trembling softness. The contract is trash, George murmured, his thumb rubbing a slow, heavy circle against her lower lip, forcing it to part slightly. You built this entire fortress of ice to keep the world out because you're terrified of being vulnerable. But you forgot one thing, sweetheart. He leaned in closer, his lips brushing against hers as he spoke, the heat of the contact sending a violent shockwave straight down her spine. Ice melts, and I have all the time in the world to burn through yours. Anna's mind went entirely blank. Her fingers gripped his shirt, wrinkling the expensive fabric as her defenses completely crumbled under the weight of his proximity. She wanted him to kiss her. She desperately, secretly wanted him to drop the teasing and just take everything. Bees. Asterisk. The sudden, harsh vibration of her personal phone on the desk shattered the silence like a gunshot. George's eyes flicked to the screen. Anna's breath caught in her throat. A massive, flashing red notification was taking over her laptop and her phone simultaneously. It wasn't a text from the restricted number. It was a live market feed. The Malloy Group's secondary trading stock was plummeting in a near vertical line. Anna, George said, his voice dropping all trace of intimacy, turning instantly into a cold, lethal frequency as he stood up and pulled her laptop toward him. We have a problem. This isn't Julian. Anna scrambled out of her chair, standing beside him as her eyes swept over the rapid-fire data. A synchronized short attack across 3 international exchanges. Someone is liquidating billions to force our margins down. It's a joint hostile takeover, George muttered, his fingers flying across her keyboard, bypassing standard security protocols to pull up the acquisition logs. His eyes darkened as 2 names flashed on the screen. The Vance family and the Richter conglomerate. They've aligned their fortunes. They're buying up our debt before the Asian markets open. Anna stared at the screen, her face going pale. They think we're weak because of the Julian scandal. They're trying to crush us while we're distracted. George slowly closed the laptop, turning to face her. The predator was fully awake now. A dark, terrifying smile touched his lips as he looked at the flashing red numbers. They think they bought a crisis, George whispered, his voice smooth and dangerous. They have no idea they just walked into a slaughterhouse. Ellipsis. Chapter 5. The red emergency lights of the corporate terminal pulsed against George's face, casting sharp, lethal shadows across his jaw. He didn't look like a man facing a multi-billion-dollar corporate execution. He looked like a grandmaster who had just watched his opponent make a fatal, predictable mistake. Call your chief of public relations, George commanded, his voice slicing through the heavy silence of the office. He didn't look at her. His eyes were already scanning a secondary monitor, tracing the rapid-fire transaction logs of the hostile entities. Tell them to hold any official statements regarding Uncle Julian. Let the market believe the Malloy Group is in total freefall. Anna's corporate instincts screamed against the order. Are you insane? If we don't counter the narrative, the panic will spread to our institutional investors by midnight. The Vance family and the Richters will buy up the remaining float for pennies. George stopped typing. He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a calm, absolute authority that pinned her in place. Let them buy it, Anna. You can't catch a wolf until it sticks its head entirely into the trap. Right now, they think they're hunting a wounded deer. Let them get comfortable. He stepped away from the desk, walking over to where her custom trench coat was draped. He picked it up and held it open for her. For now, we leave. The real war doesn't start in a boardroom. It starts tonight, behind closed doors. Anna stared at the coat, her mind a chaotic blur of numbers, market strategies, and the terrifyingly confident man standing before her. She wanted to argue, to demand a traditional defensive strategy, but looking into his eyes, she realized she trusted his dangerous calculations more than her own textbook metrics. Without a word, she stepped into the coat. George's hands lingered on her shoulders for a split second, a heavy, reassuring warmth through the fabric, before he guided her toward the private exit. At that exact moment, across the city in a high-end, penthouse cigar lounge, the mood was vastly different. Arthur Vance and Marcus Richter, the heirs to 2 of the most predatory conglomerates in the country, were clinking crystal glasses filled with 100-year-old scotch. On the massive wall-mounted screens around them, the Malloy Group's stock tickers were bleeding a continuous, satisfying river of red. By tomorrow morning, the Ice Queen will be begging us for a bailout, Marcus Richter sneered, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his gold lighter. Julian's little stunt primed the canvas, and our short attack just ripped the canvas apart. She has no leverage left. Arthur Vance didn't laugh. He sat deep in his leather armchair, staring at his tablet with a strange, tightening knot in his stomach. Unlike Marcus, who only looked at the numbers, Arthur was a man who survived on a hyper-acute, almost paranoid intuition. Something doesn't feel right, Marcus, Arthur muttered, his brow furrowing as he pulled up the live acquisition logs. What are you talking about? Look at the volume, Marcus scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. We've already secured 7% of their secondary float. They aren't even putting up a fight. The security tier hasn't issued a single cease and desist or regulatory freeze. Exactly, Arthur whispered, his voice dropping. Anna Malloy is a shark. If someone steps into her territory, she doesn't hide under a rock, she rips their throat out. Why is she letting us swallow her margins without a single public statement? Because she's broken, Marcus said, leaning forward. She's distracted by that useless, gold-digging playboy husband of hers. The tabloids have been saying for months that he's a parasite dragging her down. She's probably in her office crying right now. Arthur didn't reply. He stared at a specific data block on his screen, a minor, almost invisible shell corporation out of Nassau that had quietly absorbed a tiny fraction of their short sales. It was a drop in the ocean, but the execution style was incredibly smooth. Clean. That night, Arthur Vance didn't sleep well. When he finally drifted off near 3 a.m., his mind twisted into a vivid, terrifyingly realistic nightmare. In the dream, he was standing inside the Malloy Group's empty corporate war room. The lights were dead, save for a single spotlight illuminating the center of the mahogany table. Sitting at the head of the table wasn't Anna Malloy. It was her husband, George. He was wearing an impeccably tailored suit, his boots resting on the table, a cold, predatory smirk playing on his lips. Beside him stood a shadowy figure whose face Arthur couldn't see, but whose voice echoed through the dark room like a heavy, suffocating weight. Don't be an idiot, Arthur, the shadowy voice whispered, the tone carrying a chilling, absolute certainty that made Arthur's dream self break into a cold sweat. Look at them closely. If there was really a devastating crisis between the Ice Queen and her husband, why do they still have so much time to be all lovey-dovey in public? Why is he still walking into her boardroom like he owns her? You aren't launching a takeover, you fool. You're walking directly into a slaughterhouse. Asterisk. Arthur woke up with a violent gasp, his chest heaving, his silk sheets completely soaked in sweat. The digital clock on his nightstand read 5:14 a.m. The Asian markets had been open for 2 hours. Arthur sat on the edge of his bed, his hands shaking as he stared at his phone. The echo of the dream voice was ringing in his ears with an intense, haunting clarity. He pulled up his private terminal. The Malloy Group's stock was still low, but the selling pressure had completely flattened out. It looked like an empty valley, or a mouth waiting to snap shut. Lovey-dovey, Arthur whispered to himself, his eyes widening as a sudden, frantic realization hit him. George hadn't ruined Anna's boardroom, he had cleared it. He hadn't exposed her vulnerability, he had protected it. The slacker persona was a lie. The crisis was a manufactured vacuum designed to draw their capital out into the open. Panic, raw and evolutionary, took over Arthur Vance's mind. He didn't call Marcus. He didn't check into his office. He frantically dialed his private assistant. Book a flight to Singapore. The private charter. Now. Cancel all my appointments for the next 3 weeks. By 6:30 a.m., while the rest of the corporate world was just waking up, Arthur Vance was buckling himself into a leather seat on a private jet, sweating profusely as the plane lifted off into the gray dawn sky. He left his phone, his laptop, and his partner completely behind. He was running for his life, driven by a ghost in a dream. At 8:30 a.m., Marcus Richter walked into his executive suite at the Richter Tower, a smug smile on his face, a cup of premium espresso in his hand. Call Arthur, Marcus ordered his secretary as he sat down behind his desk. Tell him the market opens in 30 minutes. It's time to launch the final liquidity squeeze and force Anna Malloy to sign over her logistics network. 5 minutes later, the secretary returned, her face completely pale. Sir, Mr. Vance's office says he is unavailable. His personal line is disconnected, and his private tracker shows his aircraft left the country 2 hours ago. Marcus frowned, his espresso freezing halfway to his mouth. What do you mean he left the country? We're in the middle of an acquisition. Before he could process the information, the massive trading monitors on his wall flashed a violent, blinding green. The vertical red drop from the previous night didn't just stop. It reversed with a savage, explosive velocity that shattered every predictive algorithm on the screen. What is that? Marcus screamed, dropping his cup, the dark liquid pooling across his marble desk. Who is buying? Look at the capital injection. It's a counter-buy, Mr. Richter. His head trader yelled through the intercom, his voice frantic with panic. A massive, consolidated block of capital just flooded the European and domestic markets. They aren't just buying Malloy stock, they're buying our short options. They're forcing a short squeeze. Marcus's fingers flew across his keyboard, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated horror as the corporate veil was ripped away. The entity executing the squeeze wasn't the Malloy Group. It was an anonymous private equity firm backed by an encrypted Swiss routing number, the exact same routing number George had pulled up the day before. They had used Marcus's own leverage against him. Because Arthur Vance had pulled his liquidity out at dawn, Marcus's side of the joint alliance was entirely exposed, left with billions in unhedged short positions. The green line surged higher, suffocating the Richter conglomerate's margins, liquidating their assets to cover the debt at an agonizing pace. By 9:15 a.m., the Richter family empire, built over 3 generations, was entirely hollowed out. Bankrupt. Back in the quiet, dim sanctuary of the Malloy executive office, the chaos of the financial world felt a million miles away. The double doors were locked from the inside. The monitors were displaying the final, beautiful green stabilization of the Malloy stock, alongside the public notice of the Richter conglomerate's bankruptcy filing. George stood by the glass windows, his suit jacket draped over a chair, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows as he slowly turned a heavy brass key in the lock of her private war room doors. Anna sat behind her desk, her hands resting flat on the wood. The sheer adrenaline of the victory was still humming through her veins, making her chest heave slightly. They had won. They had completely annihilated a predatory alliance in less than 12 hours. But as she looked up at George, the corporate triumph vanished, replaced by a sudden, heavy, and intoxicatingly spicy tension that filled the quiet room. George turned away from the door, his eyes locking onto hers with a dark, predatory smirk that made her heart instantly skip a beat. "Business is taken care of, sweetheart," George murmured, his voice dropping into a low, velvet frequency that sent a physical shiver straight down her spine. He began walking toward her desk, his steps slow, unhurried, and completely dominant. "Now, let's talk about my reward." Chapter 6. The heavy brass lock clicked into place, a definitive, echoing sound. That seemed to seal out the rest of the world. Anna's hand stayed flat against her mahogany desk, her fingers pressing into the polished wood so hard the tips turned white. The stock tickers on her screen had finally stabilized into a peaceful, victorious green, but the frantic rhythm of her heart hadn't slowed down by a single beat. The corporate war was over. The private one was just beginning. George didn't say a word. He moved with a slow, agonizingly deliberate grace, stepping away from the locked doors. He had discarded his tie hours ago. His white collar was unbuttoned just enough to reveal the sharp line of his collarbone, and his rolled-up sleeves exposed the lean, corded muscle of his forearms. Every step he took toward her desk felt heavier, more deliberate, and entirely inescapable. "George," Anna said, intending to sound sharp, commanding, and fully in control. Instead, her voice carried a breathless, trembling softness that betrayed every single boundary she was trying to spin. "The market report is finalized. We need to prepare the press release for the board." "The board can wait," George murmured. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of her desk. Instead of leaning against it like he usually did, he walked right around the perimeter, invading her private space without a single shred of hesitation. The lazy, playful slacker she had married was nowhere to be found. This was the man who had effortlessly crushed 2 multi-billion-dollar empires before breakfast, and right now, his dark, piercing gaze was fixed entirely on her. Anna's breath caught in her throat. She tried to slide her chair back to create some distance, but George was already there. He placed both hands on the armrests of her executive chair, leaning down until his face was inches from hers, effectively caging her. The scent of him, rain, cedarwood, and a sharp, intoxicating heat, completely overwhelmed her senses. "You've been running from me all morning, Anna," George whispered, his voice a low, smooth baritone that vibrated straight through her chest. His eyes dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second before locking back onto hers. "You used the Julian crisis to hide. You used the short attack to hide. But the spreadsheet is green, the office is empty, and you're completely out of excuses." "I'm not hiding," she breathed, her chin tilting up defensively, a desperate, last-ditch effort to summon the Ice Queen. "I am the CEO of this company, George. I don't need excuses. Is that right?" A dangerous, heartbreaking smirk touched his lips. He reached out, his long fingers gently catching her jaw, his thumb smoothing over her lower lip, forcing it to part slightly. His touch was warm, possessive, and unyielding. "Then tell me why your pulse is currently trying to break through your skin." Anna's hands instinctively flew to his chest, her palms flattening against his crisp white shirt to push him away. But the moment her fingers felt the firm, heavy thud of his heartbeat and the raw warmth of his body, her strength vanished. Instead of pushing, her fingers involuntarily gripped the fabric of his shirt, wrinkling it as a violent wave of heat rushed straight up her neck. She was losing. She had built a fortress of ice for years, treating him with cold disdain to protect her own chaotic, desperate obsession with him. But now, the heat he was radiating was too much. She was melting, entirely and helplessly, from the inside out. "George, please," she whispered, her eyes fluttering shut as his lips brushed agonizingly close to her cheek, his breath hot against her skin. "Please what, sweetheart?" he murmured, his other hand sliding up to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling into her perfectly styled hair, gently pulling just enough to force her to look at him. His gaze was dark, fierce, and untamed. "You starved a hungry beast for 5 years, Anna. Did you really think I wouldn't demand my meal when the cage finally broke?" The intensity of his passion was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It wasn't teasing anymore, it was an absolute, overwhelming claim. When his lips finally met hers, the contact was electric, a deep, possessive, and breathless collision that completely shattered what was left of her control. Anna gasped into the kiss, her arms sliding up around his neck, pulling him closer as the years of pent-up, unspoken tension exploded between them. The next afternoon, the living room of a chic, minimalist downtown brownstone was filled with the sound of pouring tea and sudden, sharp laughter. "You did what?" Claire, Anna's closest childhood friend and a high-profile corporate defense attorney, nearly dropped her porcelain teacup onto her white linen rug. She stared at the woman sitting on her sofa. Anna Malloy, the untouchable, freezing, human blizzard, of the city's business elite, was currently curled into the corner of the couch, wrapped in one of Claire's oversized knit sweaters. Her usual pristine bun was a loose, messy pile on top of her head, her face was completely flushed, and she was staring intensely at her teacup as if it held the secrets to the universe. "I left the penthouse at 6 this morning," Anna muttered, her voice incredibly small, a stark contrast to her usual boardroom authority. She reached up, nervously tugging at the collar of the sweater to hide a faint, dark mark just beneath her jawline. "I didn't even leave a note. I couldn't face him when he woke up." Claire set her teacup down, her eyes wide with malicious amusement as she took in her friend's completely flustered, disheveled state. "Anna, you're the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. You literally liquidated a rival family's assets yesterday morning. And you ran away from your own husband like a teenager escaping a curfew. You don't understand, Claire," Anna said, finally looking up, her eyes wide with a mixture of panic and soft, raw emotion she had never allowed anyone to see. "He isn't who I thought he was. He's terrifying. Not in a bad way, but, when he looks at me, it's like he sees right through the company, right through the ice, straight to everything I'm trying to hide. He completely took over. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think." Claire looked at the faint mark on Anna's neck, then at the nervous, trembling way her friend was holding herself. A slow, knowing smile spread across the attorney's face. "Anna, let me get this straight," Claire said, leaning forward, resting her chin on her hands. For 5 years, you treated him like a piece of inconvenient office furniture. You froze him out, you gave him an allowance, and you acted like his existence was a corporate chore because you were too proud to admit you were crazy about him. I was protecting myself, Anna whispered defensively. Right, but now, the slacker act is gone, he just saved your empire, and he finally treated you like his wife. Claire let out a soft, dry laugh, shaking her head. You starved a hungry beast for years with that freezing attitude of yours, Anna. Now that the beast has finally tasted its meal and found exactly what it's been missing, what did you expect? You can't just run away now. I just needed a few hours to collect myself, Anna muttered, burying her face in her hands as her cheeks burned. I just needed to be somewhere where I was in control. Roar. Asterisk. The deep, unmistakable growl of a customized, high-performance sports car engine echoed from the quiet street directly outside the brownstone window. The sound was distinct, powerful, and instantly recognizable. Anna's entire body went completely rigid. Her hands slowly dropped from her face. Claire raised an eyebrow, stepping over to the large bay window and pulling the sheer curtains back. She peeked outside, and an immediate, delighted smirk crossed her face. Well, speaking of the beast, Claire said smoothly, stepping away from the glass. He's here. Anna scrambled off the couch, her heart instantly leaping into her throat as she rushed to the window. Down on the curb, parked completely illegally across Claire's driveway, was the sleek, matte black sports car. Leaning casually against the driver's side door was George. He was back in his casual wear, the faded leather jacket, a plain black t-shirt, and dark jeans, but the lazy slacker image was permanently ruined in Anna's eyes. He looked effortlessly handsome, the afternoon sun catching the sharp angles of his jaw. In his right hand, he was holding 2 cardboard coffee cups from the specific, high-end cafe near her office. As if he knew exactly which window she was standing behind, George slowly tilted his head up. His dark, piercing eyes locked directly onto hers through the glass. He didn't look angry that she had fled. He didn't look worried. He just raised one of the coffee cups in a silent, slow toast, that familiar, confident, and utterly possessive smirk spreading across his lips. The look in his eyes said everything. There is absolutely nowhere in this city you can hide from me. Asterisk. Anna pressed her hand against the glass, her breath fogging the windowpane, her heart hammering so hard it felt like a physical ache. She was flustered to her very core, but as she watched him stand there waiting for her, the heavy, defensive armor she had worn for years finally shattered for good. Go, Claire said softly from behind her, her voice full of genuine warmth. Don't keep him waiting anymore, Anna. You've both wasted enough time. Anna didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed her coat, threw open Claire's front door, and practically flew down the front steps. The cool afternoon air hit her face, but she barely felt it. Her eyes were fixed entirely on the man waiting by the car. George didn't move as she approached. He just watched her, his smirk softening into a genuine, breathtaking smile as she stopped right in front of him, breathless and slightly disheveled in her oversized sweater. You left early, George murmured, his voice low and incredibly sweet. He handed her one of the coffee cups, his fingers brushing against hers, sending a familiar, electric spark straight through her veins. I woke up and the bed was cold. I don't like it when the bed is cold, Anna. I had to visit Claire, she whispered, her voice lacking any of its usual icy distance. She looked up at him, her eyes bright and completely open. And I wanted to see if you would actually come find me. I will always come find you, George said, his tone dropping into a fierce, absolute gravity. He set his own coffee cup down on the roof of the car and reached out, his large hands gently framing her face. His thumbs lightly stroked her burning cheeks. No matter where you run, no matter how much ice you try to put between us, you're mine, Anna. I spent 5 years waiting for you to look at me the way you did last night. I'm never letting you go back into that shell. Anna's hands moved up, her fingers wrapping around his wrists. She didn't try to pull his hands away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a brief second as she accepted the total surrender of her heart. I don't want to go back, she whispered, looking back up at him with a soft, beautiful vulnerability that she had never shown the world. I'm tired of being the Ice Queen, George. I just want to be yours. George's. Dark eyes flared with an intense, profound affection. He leaned down, capturing her lips in a slow, deep, and beautifully tender kiss right there on the public sidewalk. It wasn't a corporate game, it wasn't a tactical maneuver, and there were no more threats on the horizon. It was just the two of them, completely exposed, completely alive, and entirely bound to each other. When he finally pulled back, he kept his arms wrapped securely around her waist, holding her close against his chest. He grinned down at her, the playful, charming husband fully returning. Good, George laughed softly, kissing the top of her head. Because I've officially resigned from being a slacker. From now on, my full-time job is taking care of my wife. Anna smiled, burying her face in his leather jacket, listening to the steady, unyielding beat of his heart. For the first time in her life, the empire didn't matter. The stock market didn't matter. She was exactly where she belonged, safe in the arms of the man who had burned through her winter to give her a permanent spring. Epilogue. 6 months ago, my desk was a battlefield. It was a place where I calculated risks, cut down corporate rivals, and hid behind a multi-billion-dollar empire of ice because I was too terrified to let anyone see the girl underneath. Today, my desk is covered in dynamic architectural blueprints for our new international logistics hubs, 2 half-empty mugs of artisanal coffee, and a pair of ridiculously expensive sunglasses that definitely don't belong to me. I lean back in my leather executive chair, looking out the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my office. The city skyline is bathed in a warm, amber golden hour light, reflecting off the glass in brilliant shades of orange and violet. For the first time in my life, my chest doesn't feel tight. The suffocating weight of the Malloy group is gone, replaced by a deep, steady peace. The heavy mahogany double doors of my office don't just open, they swing inward with that familiar, unhurried ease that used to drive my assistants into a panic. Now, they don't even blink. George strolls in. The charcoal 3-piece suit he wore to annihilate Uncle Julian and the Richter conglomerate has been replaced by his favorite faded leather jacket and dark jeans. He looks effortlessly handsome, the warm evening light catching the sharp, dangerous angles of his jaw as he walks toward me. "You're still staring at those spreadsheets, sweetheart," George murmurs, his voice a low, smooth baritone that instantly sends a familiar, electric shiver straight down my spine. "I thought we agreed that after 5 o'clock, you belong to me, not the market." I try to summon a tiny hint of the old Ice Queen, crossing my arms and looking up at him with a faux stern expression. "I am reviewing the final Q2 integration reports, George. As the CEO, it is my responsibility to." "Lethal," he interrupts, a lazy, heartbreaking smirk spreading across his lips. He doesn't stop at the edge of the desk. He walks right around it, completely invading my personal space. Before I can finish my sentence, he reaches down, captures the armrests of my chair, and spins me around to face him. He sinks down on one knee, trapping me in the seat, his dark, piercing eyes locking onto mine with an unyielding, possessive intensity. My breath completely hitches. My heart hammers against my ribs, a chaotic, beautiful rhythm that he activates with just a look. I used to hate how easily he shattered my control. Now, I crave it. "You're doing that thing again," George whispers, his long fingers gently catching my jaw, his thumb smoothing over my lower lip. His touch is incredibly warm, a stark, beautiful contrast to the freezing world I used to live in. "The thing where you pretend you aren't completely crazy about me." I am a very busy woman. I breathe, my hands automatically moving to his chest, my fingers gripping the fabric of his t-shirt, wrinkling it as I pull him a fraction closer. "You're a terrible liar when you're happy, Anna," he murmurs, leaning in until his lips brush against the shell of my ear, his breath hot against my skin. "Your watch is flashing again." I glance down at my wrist. The smartwatch is glowing with a high heart rate notification, 118 beats per minute. I let out a soft, helpless laugh, completely surrendering my pride as I wrap my arms around his neck. "It's a manufacturing defect," I whisper into his skin, inhaling the scent of him, rain, cedarwood, and pure, intoxicating masculinity. "Sure it is," George chuckles, his large hands sliding securely around my waist, lifting me effortlessly out of the chair and pulling me tightly against his chest. He holds me as if I am the most precious asset in the world, his heart beating a steady, protective rhythm against my shoulder. When he pulls back just enough to look at me, the lazy slacker persona is completely gone. His eyes are full of a deep, fierce, and permanent devotion. He leans down, capturing my lips in a slow, deep, and beautifully tender kiss that seals out the rest of the universe. For 5 years, I thought I was keeping him in a golden cage, funding his lazy lifestyle while I carried the weight of the world alone. I was so blind. He wasn't a parasite. He was a predator who willingly put on a leash just to stay by my side, waiting patiently for me to realize that he was the only sanctuary I ever needed. He burned through my winter. He destroyed my enemies. And in the ruins of my fortress of ice, he gave me a permanent, beautiful spring. Come on, George says softly, breaking the kiss but keeping his arm wrapped possessively around my waist as we walk toward the private exit together. I made reservations, and this time, you aren't allowed to bring your phone. I look at him, my hand slipping into his, our fingers interlocking perfectly. Lead the way, husband, I smile, completely happy to let him take the lead. The end.